Jujutsu Kaisen, full of cool and interesting abilities that are sometimes a bit difficult to understand. But fear not, for this is part 2 of the Jujutsu Kaisen Power Guide. Whereas in part 1 I elaborated a luxurious but simple power tree infographic that showed you how the various things connect, which you should totally watch if you haven't. This week we will do something I've dreaded. Because of course, with something as complex as cursed energy, just speaking about the generals and the basics is not enough. No, dear friends, today I am here to explain every single ability in Jujutsu Kaisen. This will be accurate up until chapter 164, because among the many powers bestowed upon me as a YouTuber, seeing the future is not part of it yet. Before we get started, a few ground rules. Obviously, I am only going to explain abilities that have been explained in the series. I'm not going to try and headcanon abilities that we know exist but we haven't seen yet. For example, we know Hakari has a cursed ability, but we have never seen him use it, or at least we've never seen it used in a way that is explainable, so I'm not gonna go over that. Also, this video will be full of spoilers because I guess I cannot talk about every character without going into spoilers, so that kind of should be obvious, but here's your warning for the few of you that need this. But aside from that, anything goes. Villains, main characters, side characters, I'm gonna do them all. And I have a list here in front of me. I can't even count how many there are, so let's just get started. And I just hope this video doesn't kill one or more of us. Alright, let's get started immediately with our main character, Yuji Itadori. His abilities are a perfect example of how Jujutsu Kaisen's power system is sometimes not quite typical, because usually when you have a power system with a main ability in it, the main character will have that ability. However, the main draw of cursed energy as a power system is the cursed technique, and Yuji has none. He has no innate, inherited, or otherwise acquired cursed technique as of yet, and his fighting style is basically just him reinforcing his physical punches with his immense cursed energy that he has thanks to being infused with Sukuna. He does have a few aces up his sleeve, however. Because he is so untrained in cursed energy, his energy flow was at the start incredibly irregular, to the point where he had a full second of lag between his movements and his cursed energy flow. What this meant for the superhumanly strong Itadori was that when he punched somebody, there was a chance that his cursed energy could crash into them after the fact to produce a secondary hit. This technique was later named Divergent Fist, and relies on Itadori's bad control over his cursed energy. However, he has started using this ability less and less as he's gotten more proficient at using his energy flow. As a result of that better energy flow, he's also one of the few sorcerers who is able to produce a black flash, as he has done so on numerous occasions. Though again, remember, he is not capable of doing it willingly because no one can. So basically, Itadori has a non-technique, which is the Divergent Fist, and he's capable of producing the Black Flash. Think back to our infographic here. Next up, we have the edgelord of our main trio, Megumi Fushiguro. Megumi is the descendant of the Zen'nin clan and has inherited their bloodline cursed technique. So basically, it's the cursed technique that is unique to that family, and all family members want them or their children to inherit it, because whoever inherits it is seen as basically the rightful heir. In Megumi's case, this is the 10 Shadows technique, an ability that allows the user to interact with shadows as a medium. What this means is that they can, for example, store weapons within shadows, in some cases move within shadows, and most importantly, they can summon things through shadows. And that summoning ability is what informs the 10 Shadows' most powerful tool. When you are given the 10 Shadows technique, you receive the ability to summon 2 divine dogs, and then you're told that you have 9 slots to go. What do I mean by 9 slots? Well, the 10 Shadows technique is able to summon 10 different Shikigami, 10 different spirits through its shadows. However, the user cannot immediately summon them when he first inherits the technique. He must summon them once, defeat them, exercise them, and then tame them. So it's basically like a progression system. You start out with the 2 dogs that you get for free, which count for 1 slot, and then start unlocking more and more by defeating your other summons. You can then get stuff like an owl or an elephant. However, the final summon, the strongest Shikigami that the 10 Shadows technique can produce, has never been tamed. What's important here is that if any of your summons after you've tamed them gets destroyed during their servitude to you, they are gone forever from your inventory. But their essence lives on, which means that some of their abilities and some of their powers are passed on to your remaining spirits. What's also important to note is that you can actually summon 2 of those at the same time to combine them into one temporarily. For example, Megumi has on occasion summoned the toad and the owl at the same time, essentially producing flying toads. Because of the ability to potentially summon 10 completely different spirits with different abilities, this technique is obviously incredibly flexible and very, very powerful. And Megumi has refined it to the point where he can also use a domain expansion. His domain expansion is called Chimera Shadow Garden, and is currently considered incomplete because of its barrier, not really being there. However, it can, as of right now, produce a massive swamp of shadow from within which Megumi can essentially summon an infinite amount of his usually limited familiars. Additionally to that, he can travel freely through that shadow and even create shadow doppelgangers. However, because this domain is currently incomplete, it also causes him enormous physical backlash, and it is very dangerous to use because of it. Next up, Nobara Kugisaki, the feisty girl of the main group. She is another rather straightforward example because she simply has a curse technique. Not an inherited one, she isn't from any of the great families, she just has a technique she was born with. That technique being the straw doll technique, which allows her to use her cursed energy in conjunction with a hammer, nails, and a little straw doll, think voodoo. She mainly has 2 versions of that technique. One of them is straw doll technique hairpin, where she imbues the nails that she carries around with cursed energy, throws them into the target, and then detonates them in a blast of cursed explosions. This can be incredibly deadly if the nail is already embedded in the target, and can otherwise direct the nails in the air as well. The second way she uses her technique is straw doll technique resonance. This is a bit more abstract, but basically, if she can grab a hold of something that represents her target, a piece of DNA, a hair strand, maybe a body part that they lost, she can nail it to her straw doll, which causes a chain reaction when the target that body part or piece of DNA that belonged to is damaged from afar. Again, think voodoo. In this case, that damage is immense and black thorns start sprouting from their bodies. It is enough to even kill lower grade cursed spirits. Additionally to all of that, Nobara has also on one occasion produced a black flash. Moving on to the second year students, we have Maki Zen'nin, strong and beautiful. She is a very easy example because she has no cursed technique to speak of. In fact, she has no cursed energy to speak of beyond the tiniest amounts. She is an example of a heavenly restriction. Remember, a pact that is forced onto a child by an unknown entity at birth that can have very extreme effects over time. In the case of Maki, what it did to her was that she was born with no ability to really generate cursed energy, essentially being incapable of becoming a sorcerer forever. But in return, she was given a superhumanly strong body, being able to leap several feet into the air and even able to catch bullets mid-air. She is crazy strong, and the trade-off is that she cannot really partake in exorcisms if she doesn't use a cursed tool, which, by the way, cursed tools are just weapons that are imbued with cursed energy and sometimes with a cursed technique. That's just as an aside, since I saw people asking that in the comments. For example, Maki uses a lot of swords and staffs that have cursed energy applied to them so that she can fight cursed spirits as well, since cursed spirits can only be really hurt by cursed energy. Also, her glasses are technically also a curse tool because they allow her to see curses, which she usually cannot because she has no energy. The next second year is Toge Inumaki, the silent goofball of the second year group. He is the heir to the powerful Inumaki clan, and so he uses their inherited cursed technique called cursed speech. Those tattoos or marks that he has around his mouth allow him to imbue his very words with his cursed energy. And what this in effect means is that if he gives you an order using those signs, you will probably have to obey unless you can shield yourself from his words somehow. You can do that usually by reinforcing your ears with cursed energy, but it's difficult to do because of how powerful and versatile this technique is. If he tells you to go to sleep, you will probably fall asleep. And if he tells you to explode, you will probably explode. However, this technique has many drawbacks. It is immensely taxing on the throat of the user, which is why Inumaki has to keep using cough drops whenever he's in combat for too long. Additionally, his words may not work on an opponent that is too strong, or in the worst case, they might even just bounce back on him. And the final thing that is very difficult to control about this technique is that because those seals are permanently on his face, he must be very careful not to accidentally activate it while speaking, which is why Toge specifically avoids saying proper words unless he's in combat, usually only speaking in sushi ingredients. Next up, we have Panda, who is a panda. Now, obviously, he's not really a human being. Panda is what is considered a cursed corpse. This sounds very macabre, but really what it is you take a humanoid-ish shaped inanimate object like a doll, manipulate it to receive cursed energy, and then fill it with cursed energy, giving it a pseudo-life. Usually these things are very limited, only able to produce a couple of different commands, and usually not even really able to speak. However, as long as they have a cursed energy core within them, they are considered technically living beings. Panda is special. He has 3 cores instead of 1, and is much more conscious and much more living than other cursed corpses. His 3 cores are sometimes even considered 3 separate entities, as he calls those cores his siblings. There is the middle core, the balanced type Panda core, which is the one that he has on most of the time. While this core is the dominant one, he looks like a panda and is rather docile and able to both attack and defend very effectively. He has 2 more cores, one of which we never found out what it actually does, called his sister core, which we think could be defensively oriented because his brother core is the power type gorilla core, which, when Panda switches to that, turns him into more of a gorilla-like appearance, in which he's much more powerful and much more offensive. It is also here where he can use an ability called the unblockable drumming beat, which is basically that when he hits you while in gorilla mode, the vibrations of his punch are so strong that even if you block his punch, the vibrations will still do internal damage to you. Next up, we have Yuta Okkotsu, the final second-year student and the main character of Jujutsu Kaisen 0. Yuta's situation is a bit special, because in his case, his power comes from the fact that he has a vengeful cursed spirit bound to him, Rika, the leftovers of his dead childhood friend. With the help of Rika, Yuta has an enormous arsenal of cursed energy at his disposal, being able to infuse it into his katana and his physical attacks. Additionally, by unleashing Rika, he can cause enormous destructive damage, but none of this really fits into any of the categories we have established. He doesn't use a specific curse technique. He's also been shown to, at one point, be able to copy curse speech using a curse speech megaphone. Whether or not he has the innate ability to copy other curse techniques is, as of right now, inconclusive, however, since we haven't seen enough of him yet. What he does have, however, is enormous cursed energy control to the point where he can produce reverse cursed energy to heal his comrades if he needs to. Of the third-year students, we only know the ability of Kirara Hoshi. the friend of Kinji Hakari. Their technique is the first one in this video where I can understand if you're very confused at it because it is very difficult to explain properly. Kirara's curse technique is called Love Rendezvous. Basically, Kirara has 5 markings that are named after stars within the Southern Cross star constellation. These stars all have a different distance to the Earth, and the objects that she marks with those stars can only approach each other in the order from furthest from Earth to closest from Earth. So, let's say you are marked with star number 1 and you want to reach a door that is marked with star number 5. You cannot just approach star number 5 leisurely, you will be repelled. Instead, because you are the furthest star from the Earth and number 5, the door, is the closest star from the Earth, you have to first approach all the other marked stars in order of their distance from Earth until you are allowed to reach the star. More importantly, she can also mark multiple objects with the same star. Now that we're done with the students of Jujutsu Tokyo High, we can get to the faculty of Tokyo Jujutsu High. First up, we have the principal of the school, Masamichi Yaga. Remember cursed corpses, the thing I explained in Panda's segment? Yeah, Masamichi Yaga has a curse technique that allows him to produce cursed corpses. He is also the one that produced and birthed Panda, and he considers him his son for that reason. Additionally, what he can as well do is that he can take the soul information, as in the knowledge about what someone was in life of a deceased person, and infuse it into a cursed corpse, causing that cursed corpse to act as if it were that person. However, he will only do so in very rare occasions, as he considers it a sacrilege. Here we go. The character you're probably watching this video for, Satoru Gojo. I have already made a video specifically about his technique, but I can go over it once again because it never stops being confusing. So, Gojo is the heir to the Gojo clan, one of the 3 big clans, the other 2 being the Zenin and the Kamo clan. The Gojo clan is special because it has 2 inherited crown curse techniques, 2 techniques that everyone in the family is after. And Satoru was born with both of them. The first is the 6 eyes, those beautiful blue eyes that you see in all the promotional material. These eyes allow Gojo to see cursed energy on an incredibly detailed level, being able to essentially see the world as a heat map of cursed energy. Additionally, they allow him to see many physical factors of his environment that are usually hidden to normal eyes, such as mass, momentum, and speed. But, maybe more importantly, these eyes allow him to control his own cursed energy flow to absolute perfection. It has been described to be so good that he can basically use his abilities at no energy cost, being able to run as a perpetual motion machine, basically. However, this pales in comparison to what he can do if he uses the 6 eyes to control his actual main cursed technique and the second inherited technique that he has, the Limitless. In the most basic terms, the Limitless is capable of producing infinities, of taking the abstract concept of an infinite number and turning it into a reality. For example, if you remember math class, if you take 0 and 1 and the distance between the two, and you keep halving that distance, you will never reach 1. You will always keep halving that distance infinitesimally until there are just an infinite number of fractions, but you will never ever actually get to 1. This is a type of infinity that Gojo can produce, namely, he covers himself in that infinity so that anyone that wants to touch him can, if Gojo doesn't allow it, only touch that infinity, traveling endlessly and slowly through this space between 0 and 1, between them and Gojo. Gojo, however, can freely touch anything he wants. He decides who gets through this infinite barrier. Now, usually, doing this would take an enormous amount of energy, especially because Gojo likes to keep this barrier up 24/7. However, thanks to the 6 eyes, he can keep it running at basically no cost, using up almost 0 energy while doing so. But there's another problem. Using a cursed technique is not just taxing on your cursed energy, but also on your brain, because you have to actually keep it running in the background. Gojo's brain should, by all intents and purposes, just burn up after using this technique for so long. But he has found a solution. Because he's Satoru Gojo and can do basically anything, he is also capable of using reverse cursed energy, healing energy, and so he has this cycle going within his body where he uses his limitless to keep himself shielded at all times, which fries his brain, but then he uses his reverse cursed energy to immediately heal his brain so that it can just keep doing it. And thanks to the Six Eyes, this process takes up almost no energy. Gojo can just keep doing this forever, keep using up his technique, using his brain, healing his brain, using the technique again, over and over again. The only fuel this needs is food, and in Gojo's case, a lot of sweets because they stimulate his brain, as per his own account. Now, this is the most basic application of the Limitless, but it isn't actually Gojo's main curse technique. By amplifying this creation of infinities, he can use his extended curse technique, which is called Blue. This technique works by taking a point in space and producing a concentrated amount of infinities, of physical impossibilities within it. Think of it as producing -1 apples. It doesn't make sense, and that's the point. Gojo creates a piece of fucky space wherein physics don't work, and because the universe always tries to make shit work, it starts pulling matter into that point in the hopes of filling it with stuff that makes sense. What this means, in essence, is that Gojo can produce a gravitational singularity, a mini black hole that sucks stuff towards it. This singularity that is produced by Curse Technique Blue, he can then also move around for even more destruction, and he can use it in smaller doses to attract people from far away closer to him into clobbering distance. Now, if you've been paying attention, you've noticed that Gojo has both a cursed technique and is able of using reverse cursed energy. So, if you've been paying attention, if you remember our infographic, shouldn't he be able to use a reverse curse technique or a curse technique reversal? Yes, of course. He's Satoru Gojo, he can do anything. So, if you take Blue, which is the ability to attract, and revert it by fueling it with reverse energy, you get Red, the ability to repel, which essentially produces a small point in space that explosively repels anything that gets into contact with it. You can think of it as just a big repulsion beam. Now, because Gojo is from one of the big clans, a lot of people know about him. He's basically a celebrity, and so are his powers. All of what I've just described is something that most people are aware of when it comes to Gojo's power set, at least the people that are into Jujutsu Society. However, even within the Gojo clan, there is a hidden technique. Not necessarily a curse technique, not a reverse curse technique, but a combination of the two. What happens if you use both Blue and Red, attraction and repulsion, at the same time? They mix into Hollow Technique Purple, which doesn't attract, it doesn't repel, but it obliterates. Hollow Technique Purple produces a imaginary mass, whatever the fuck that is, that basically doubles as a giant blast that rips stuff apart at an atomic level. It is a giant nuke beam that destroys anything in its path and is by far one of the strongest attacks in the entire series. It is 100% unblockable, and Gojo uses it as an insta-kill when he knows he has to get shit done. Now, as you've probably noticed, Gojo is pretty good at what he does. And so, because he's so good at Jujutsu, obviously, he also has his own domain expansion, called Infinite Void. Remember, domain expansions are spaces, pocket dimensions that you fill with your own curse technique, and in this case, he fills a pocket space with the Limitless, with infinity. And the infinity that he creates in here is particularly brutal. When you're trapped in the Infinite Void, all the processes that go in your moment-to-moment existence, your thoughts, your physical processes, your emotions, are repeated infinitely, to the point where you can never actually conclude thinking or feeling or standing. What this means is that you're paralyzed and forever trapped in a flow of endless, repetitive information. It is said that staying too long in his domain expansion will cause brain damage to people that are trapped in it, and Gojo has to be careful to not accidentally do that to enemies he wants to question later. However, he can protect people from being affected by this brain damage if he holds them and touches them while they're inside. And this doesn't cover all the abilities we've seen Gojo do. He can use the Limitless to fly somehow, and he can also teleport under specific conditions. He can't just randomly do it, and there seems to be a limit to it, but the explanation we've gotten so far have been very sporadic. Oh, and he's also been said to have used the Black Flash at one point, because of course he has. Alright, getting back to the normal characters of Jujutsu faculty, we have Shoko Ieri, who is the school nurse and was at one point a classmate of Gojo. She's much simpler, she can heal people really well. Basically, she's really good at reverse cursed energy and reverse curse techniques. We've not seen her do anything else, and frankly, after telling you about Gojo, I'm fine with that. Next up, we have Atsuya Kusakabe, sword-wielding teacher at Jujutsu High. He is one of the characters that doesn't seem to have an innate curse technique, but instead relies on learnable techniques. Remember that in our graphic? He specifically relies on sword-related techniques of the new Shadow Style school, which is a school of learnable techniques dedicated to using swords and other objects to counter curse techniques and to be just as effective. He uses two techniques out of this school specifically. New Shadow Style Bato sword drawing, for example, is a fast sword drawing technique that will cover the blade with cursed energy and rotates that energy around the blade to increase the drawing speed dramatically, essentially shooting it out of its sheath and decapitating anyone who is in its way. This is a very strong ability that can give you an edge in battle. His other ability is New Shadow Style Evening Moon sword drawing, but we have no clue what it does because he was interrupted while doing it. But as you can see, the new Shadow Style school is very much focused on this countering and drawing techniques with swords. It does have some other things that we'll get into later, however. Next up, we have Kyotaka Ijichi, the non-combatant administrator of Jujutsu High Tokyo. He does not have a curse technique at all because he's not a fighter, but he does give us an opportunity to talk about barrier techniques. Barrier techniques are a subcategory of mostly learnable techniques, and they do exactly what the name suggests. They create barriers. In Ichichi's case, he's capable of producing the most basic type of barrier, a curtain, which is essentially a big veil over an area that can hide it from other people, prevent someone from entering, prevent someone from leaving, among other effects. These barriers again work on a giving and taking system, where you have to set up certain disadvantages to the barrier in order to reap certain advantages. Want to create a massive barrier that covers an enormous area? Fair enough, but in that case you need to give it some disadvantage, like for example, points that when destroyed will also lose the barrier, and making those points incredibly obvious. The danger from that obviousness giving you the disadvantage that you can then turn into the advantage of a large area. Or for example, want to make a barrier that keeps a specific person out? Okay, but in return, it lets everyone else in. Creating just a general barrier like a curtain, like Ichichi does, is basically a very easy thing to do, but you can refine it pretty much endlessly, to the point where people who are good at specifically doing barrier techniques are very sought after. As a matter of fact, some of the most important people in the Jujutsu society are people who use barrier techniques, since the entire social structure of Jujutsu sorcery would collapse if they weren't able to produce barriers that hide them from general non-sorcerer society. Which brings us to our final character from Jujutsu Tokyo High, and that is Master Tengen, the starfish himself. He may not look it anymore, but Tengen is indeed a human being, and a very important one at that. Tengen has an unnamed barrier technique that strengthens all the barrier techniques employed by his allies, which include the entirety of Jujutsu Society. It is his life force and his energy that powers the barriers that keep Jujutsu Society hidden and safe from the outside world. Without him, no barriers would really work, and it is also his life force that makes the barriers produced by people like Ijichi much stronger. The reason that is the case is because Tengen is immensely old, said to be over 1,000 years old. He has achieved this because of his actual innate curse technique called immortality. Fairly simple. He straight up just does not die. But not dying is not the same as not aging, as he does continuously grow older and wiser. The problem with that is that if he's allowed to age indefinitely, eventually he will start evolving his spirit into something non-human, potentially becoming some sort of eldritch god that might not want to help humanity but destroy it. In order to prevent that, Master Tengen must fuse with a compatible human body every 500 years, essentially to keep himself human. This, however, was interrupted once in the past, which led to him looking this gross. Alright, next up we'll be moving into the Kyoto Jujutsu High School. This is the parallel school to the Tokyo school, which is the one we usually follow. Here we can start with the only first year we know of, which is Arata Nitta, who has really only appeared for a handful of scenes, but was enough to get us a look at his cursed technique. He has an innate cursed technique that is so far unnamed, but it has the ability to essentially freeze wounds. What this means is that he can take a wound that is currently festering or getting worse and freeze it in time, so to speak, making it so that it won't get any worse. However, this does not heal the wound, it just prevents it from getting worse, and this ability does not affect any wounds that are afflicted after the ability is activated. Next up, we're already at the second years of Kyoto High, namely with Mai Zen'nin, the twin sister of Maki Zen'nin. Other than her sister, she actually does have a bit of cursed energy, but not much herself, which also informs her innate cursed technique that she was born with, which is called construction. This technique should be able to allow you to construct things, physical objects, out of your cursed technique and your cursed ability. However, because Mai is so weak and she has so little cursed energy, all she can do is she can produce about 1 bullet per day out of her cursed energy, which is really limiting. Also, after having used it, she is severely tired and exhausted, which means that this really is not a very practical ability. However, she pairs it with her very obvious 6-shooter gun to do a pretty powerful bluff where she fires 6 times and hopes that her opponent gets careless because they think she's used up all her shots, when in reality she can produce a 7th bullet out of nowhere. However, as I said, because of her low energy, this trick only works once per day. Another reason why she's so limited in using this is because not only does she have low cursed energy, but construction as a technique also requires a disproportionate amount of energy to even pull off in the first place, so she really just got the short end of the stick. Next up, we have Kokichi Muta, which most of you probably know better as Mekamaru. He is a very weird character at first, but once you remember that heavenly restrictions exist, he's actually not that complicated. Remember Maki, who was given a superhuman body in return for having no cursed energy at all, basically? Well, Kokichi is the exact opposite case. He was born with an immense amount of cursed energy and a very fine amount of control over it. But, as a disadvantage, he was born with a broken body, with skin that bristles under the moonlight, and a lower half that was completely useless, as well as an arm that pretty much fell off right after his birth. However, he was also born with the innate curse technique called puppet manipulation, which means that he can control a large amount of artificial bodies all across Japan that he just has to mark with his cursed seals. It was one of those bodies that took part in the Kyoto Goodwill event, one of those brown robots that you remember from the anime. Now, those robots, because they can be modeled, can basically have a wide range of abilities, from lasers to blades to drills, pretty much anything goes. Kokichi even has built a giant mecha that he can pilot from the cockpit in its head that has even more abilities, bigger lasers, bigger punches, and even a special missile type where you can store a type of curse technique into the missiles in order to then launch them at the enemy. We've only ever seen him store one type of technique in those missiles, namely a simple domain, which we'll get to in a second, but it is not exactly clear what the limits of this technique would be. The final second tier of Kyoto that we have to talk about is Kasumi Miwa, the sword-wielding cutie of the class. She uses her sword for most of her attacks, and so she's also a user of the new Shadow School style, which is also what we learned with Kusakabe earlier in the video. Specifically, she also uses the Bato sword drawing, an ability where she uses her cursed energy to accelerate the drawing of her sword and make the blade deadlier by spinning the cursed energy around it. However, Miwa can also use Simple Domain, which is a good opportunity for us to finally cross that off the list, because I remember seeing a lot of people complaining and being confused about that specifically. Now, you remember how the new Shadow School style is also part of the learnable technique branch? Well, so is Simple Domain. Simple Domain is, in simplest terms, a counter to domain expansions and curse techniques that was specifically made to be used by people who are too weak to straight up fight those other people. Simple domains are a type of ability that, within a very, very small radius, can negate either curse techniques or domain expansions. The specific conditions for that are sometimes a bit different from user to user, but generally the things that make a simple domain consistent is that it has a very small radius, but grants protection against domain expansions at the very least, sometimes also against curse techniques. Additionally, you can sometimes imbue additional effects on it depending on your skill level. For example, Miwa's simple domain works in conjunction with her sword technique. When she erects the simple domain, it creates a sort of line in the sand. Anyone who steps into her domain automatically activates her sword drawing, which means that she can attack someone without having to think about it and with basically no reaction time. Sounds quite powerful, but again, it has a few very distinct drawbacks. For one, the radius of a simple domain is very limited, usually around 2 or so meters. And beyond that, simple domains can be deactivated very simply. For example, Miwa's simple domain will deactivate the moment she moves her feet. Nonetheless, simple domain remains a relatively powerful ability if used in the right situations, and can really help you in a pinch when you're up against a sorcerer that is just that much more powerful than you. And we will see quite a few more of these domain countering abilities, which just kind of goes to show of how big of a problem characters with domain expansions are to Jujutsu society. Moving into the Kyoto third years, we have Noritoshi Kamo, the heir to the big Kamo clan, one of the 3 big clans next to Gojo and Zen'nin. Initially born outside of wedlock and therefore shunned by his clan, Noritoshi was welcomed back into it once they realized that he had inherited their crowned curse technique, the main one all the family members want. In the Kamo clan's case, that is blood manipulation, which pretty much already tells you all you need to know about it in the name. Blood manipulation gives the user complete control over their own blood. This means being able to change its composition, its consistency, its position in space, pretty much anything. For example, Noritoshi can use his blood to form blades and discs, or he can throw a bag full of his blood on his opponent and then burst it to create a sort of blood prison, which then solidifies, or he can even drip arrows in his blood and then fire them and control them mid-air after firing to some degree. Or, one of my personal favorite ways he uses this technique is flowing red scale, where he increases his temperature, pulse rate, and red blood cells within his body in order to basically create steroids within him to make him faster and stronger for a short period of time. It is an incredibly flexible ability that makes him incredibly powerful, and that really shows you why the Kamo clan gets to play along with the Gojos and the Zennins. His deadliest combination of abilities is Convergence, where he compresses and condenses blood to its absolute physical limits within its hands, and Piercing Blood, where he just fires basically a giant missile of blood into his opponent after compressing it, usually being incredibly deadly. The next third year from Kyoto High on the list is Aoi Todo, the lovable gorilla best friend. He has one technique that is supremely powerful in the way he uses it. His inherited curse technique is Boogie Woogie, which, in the most simplest terms, allows him to switch the positions of two objects by clapping his hands. Those objects can be two people, it can be himself and someone else, or it can be two objects that have cursed energy. The only limit to what he can switch around is that it has to have cursed energy within it for him to target it. But besides that, he can freely switch the positions of two objects whatever he desires. The technique can only be activated by clapping, but not every time he claps activates the technique. He gets to choose. And additionally, he doesn't have to even clap both of his hands. He just has to clap two hands. He can also use the hands of his opponents, for example. Todo further strengthens this technique through a binding vow, namely showing one's cards, or one's hand, because he spends most of the battle explaining his ability to his opponents, which gives his ability a power boost and doesn't really change things for his opponent, because knowing how Boogie Woogie works doesn't really protect you from just randomly being teleported into danger. Besides this, however, Todo is a very capable sorcerer, having even produced a Black Flash on one occasion. And he's also a character that is capable of producing a simple domain. However, he has only done that once, and only in a very desperate situation. The final student of Kyoto High that we should talk about is Momo Nishimiya, the little witch girl. Her ability is fairly simple. She has a cursed technique called Tool Manipulation, and she can use it to control her broom at will, which is how she flies on it. That's basically it. She can use her broom to then produce gusts of wind that are infused with cursed energy and are thus more powerful, but yeah, that's it. That's what she can do. She's just a tiny little witch girl. You go, girl. The final member of Kyoto School that we should talk about, and its principal, is Yashinobu Gakuganji. His curse technique is pretty funky. His innate curse technique allows him to turn sound into waves of cursed energy that he can launch at people. And the way he uses it is that he basically plays the electric guitar and then uses his body as a loudspeaker to throw the waves of cursed energy at his opponent. And that's kind of it. That's really all we've ever seen of it. But it is supposed to be pretty powerful. Moving on, we get to the more independent sorcerers of the series, starting of course with the iconic Kento Nanami, office worker and overall kind of bored dude. Nanami has an innate curse technique called the Ratio Technique, which is very cool because he can basically divide anything in his head into a ratio of 7 to 3. If he then hits the perfect ratio point between those two numbers, he can create a forcible weak point that does hella damage. What he can target is basically completely up to him, if he wants to divide an entire human body, or just a limb, or even inanimate objects with it. He can also perform an extended version of this technique called Ratio Technique Collapse, where he basically just creates a weak point in larger environments or structures, like when he breaks an entire tunnel into pieces. Feats like these is possible due to the binding vow he has with himself, overtime. Basically, during the working hours, so basically from 9 to 5 throughout the day, he is slightly weaker than he should be. He's at about 80 to 90% of his full power. But if he ever has to fight outside of office hours, over time activates and grants him a boost of up to about 110 or 120% of his regular power. This can be incredibly powerful in a pinch, and is further amplified by the fact that he regularly reveals his hand, explaining his ability to his enemies to make his ability stronger. Additionally, Kento Nanami is the record holder for the most Black Flashes performed consecutively, at 4. However, this obviously changed after Yuji. Next, we have Takuma Ino, enthusiastic grade 2 sorcerer. He only has one innate curse technique, but a really cool one. His curse technique is called Auspicious Beast Summon, and it works by Ino covering his face in a mask and turning himself into a medium for various summon abilities. Basically, he can summon 4 beasts that can buff him: Kaichi, Reiki, Kirin, and Ryu. We've seen only 3 of them, and even then not completely, but these buffs can range from giving him the ability to hit his targets with a flying horn of energy, making him faster with water flowing around his feet, or even cloak his hand in energy and electricity Shidori style. Next up, we have Mei Mei, the money MILF of Jujutsu Kaisen. She has one innate curse technique called Blackbird Manipulation. She is basically able to imbue crows with cursed energy and control them. She can control multiple of them at the same time, and it can cover vast distances, and she can also share the vision with the birds, allowing her to see what they see, which makes her very useful for surveillance. However, the true ability behind Blackbird Manipulation is called Bird Strike. In this brutal attack, Mei Mei forces the bird to commit suicide, but this counts as a binding vow, and in exchange for the bird's life, in the last moments of its existence, the bird is granted a huge boost in cursed energy, allowing for a blast of destructive energy that can kill even special grade curses with one hit, making it one of the strongest single attacks a non-Gojo sorcerer can use. Moving into the Zen'nin clan, we get to Naobito Zen'nin, the piece of shit master of the Zen'nin clan, and Naoya Zen'nin, his piece of shit son. I'm grouping them together because they both have the exact same technique called Projection Sorcery. If you weren't watching this video for Gojo's ability, you're probably watching it for this ability, since this one is infamously difficult to understand, because it works on a couple of very abstract levels and is mostly just Gege freaking out about animation. But let's go through it together. Projection Sorcery is an inherited curse technique between Naobito and Naoya, which allows the user to take a second of time and divide it into 24 sections, basically frames, like in animation. The user can then trace a predetermined path of themselves across those 24 frames. Basically, in their head, before they activate their ability, they sketch out a way of movement for themselves within that 1 second that works on a rule of 24 movements per second. Those movements are not necessarily limited by physics. While they cannot do crazy shit like fly or jump twice in midair, they can move incredibly fast due to it, since they can just make themselves teleport between those 24 frames. This ability allows the user of Projection Sorcery to move insanely quickly, because not only are their moves now not really bound by physics anymore, they are also predetermined and automatic, so that Naobito and Naoya don't necessarily have to worry about anything aside from attacking. However, this technique has a second half. By touching the opponent while activating the technique, you force this rule onto them as well, causing them to have to move at 24 movements per second. What this basically means is that for the next second, you, after you've been hit with this technique, are not allowed to make movements that require more precision or more sophistication than 24 movements per second. And should you not be able to follow this rule, you will be frozen in what seems to be like an animation frame or piece of paper for 1 second, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when your opponent can basically zip around the battlefield at lightning fast speeds, being frozen for 1 second is basically a death sentence. Additionally, Naobito specifically has one other ability, namely a learnable barrier technique called Falling Blossom Emotion. This is very similar to Simple Domain in that it is a counter technique against domain expansions. If you remember, Simple Domain essentially casts its own tiny version of a domain that then protects the user. Meanwhile, Falling Blossom Emotion just concentrates cursed energy within the user and prepares to automatically intercept a guaranteed hit attack from a domain expansion. You can think of it as an auto counter that you can activate. Again, very similar to Simple Domain, but a different technique nonetheless. Next up, we have Ogi Zen'nin, piece of shit father of Maki. We didn't see much of him, but we did get to see his innate cursed technique called Blazing Courage, which basically allows him to cloak his blades into flames. That's it. It's a cool fire buff, but nothing more. And he can also use Falling Blossom Emotion just like Naobito. The final Zen'nin for now, we have Jinichi Zen'nin, leader of the Hei group within the Zen'nin clan. His technique never got named, but we did get to see it. He has an innate curse technique that allows him to conjure giant fists behind him that can accompany his own punches. They are really big and really destructive, being able to easily destroy an entire building. Moving on, we have Hiromi Higuruma, newest character on this list, and one of my personal favorites. His abilities are a bit special because he does not have an innate curse technique as we know right now. However, he's capable of doing some crazy shit nonetheless. For one, he's capable of summoning a Shikigami, a familiar spirit called Judgeman, which is basically an impartial but impatient judge entity that appears behind him. And with his help, he can produce a domain expansion without having his own curse technique named so far. His domain expansion, Deadly Sentencing, allows him to produce a courtroom that has a couple of special rules. While most modern domain expansions are deadly, guaranteed hit zones that rely on immediate violence from the user, Deadly Sentencing doesn't have that. It's described by Yuji as a more ancient domain expansion, which were much more focused on just enforcing rules on the opponent rather than immediately killing them. And Deadly Sentencing works the exact same way. Instead of allowing any violence, violence is actually completely forbidden within this domain, and instead it takes the form of a courtroom hearing, with the user becoming the prosecutor and the victim becoming the accused. Judgeman knows everything about the victim's life and will make an accusation against them. It will also produce an envelope with evidence to back up that accusation. However, the user, Higuruma, will not have access to that evidence until the end of the trial. The victim must then either defend themselves, deny, or plead guilty. If Judgeman and Higuruma find the victim guilty, they will be subject to a number of special effects, most notably that they will lose access to their cursed energy for the time being, which can be a death sentence in a battle. However, if the victim did anything besides pleading guilty in their first trial and still lost, they can ask for a retrial. Moving swiftly along, we finally get to the villains of the series, curses and curse users. Now just to recap, because I saw a couple of people be confused about it, a curse or a cursed spirit is a being that is produced from cursed energy within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. They can be monstrous or humanoid in shape, but they all share a couple of characteristics. They mostly hate humanity and can use cursed energy to very fine degrees, healing themselves with it without having to reverse it, and being able to fling it at enemies with basically no strings attached. Now, a curse user is a bit more of a difficult term if you first encounter it, but a curse user is basically just a human Jujutsu sorcerer who has abandoned the Jujutsu Society. someone who has basically decided to go against the system. Basically, if you're a human who can use jujutsu, if you work for the jujutsu government, you're a sorcerer. If you work against it, you're a curse user. Simple as that. Another important note about cursed spirits, however, is that there are some primordial cursed spirits, beings made from cursed energy that are associated with some basic principles of life and the world, which is the case for the first one we're looking at, which is Mahito. Mahito is a cursed spirit born from a very specific set of negative emotions, namely all the hate and vitriol humanity feels against itself and against others. He is humanity's hatred and ugliness given a shape and form. It is this quality that makes him incredibly powerful and allows him to be comprised of an immense amount of cursed energy, because, as you certainly know, humanity is in no short demand for hatred. It is this connection to humanity that gives Mahito a very special ability. Mahito is capable of perceiving souls. Basically, he can look at a living being and innately see the shape of its soul, which is some sort of abstract construct within their being. As Mahito explains, souls in Jujutsu Kaisen are inextricably bound to the body they inhabit, and if a soul changes shape, so does the body. And so, Mahito's innate curse technique, called Idle Transfiguration, takes advantage of this relationship. Mahito's Idle Transfiguration allows him to touch someone's soul and change their shape, and by changing the shape of someone's soul, he can basically shapeshift them or himself. He can use that to heal himself, to mutate people until they die, to transform them into monsters to do his bidding, to fuse people into weird blob monsters, or even to try and fuse two souls that will then repel each other, creating a sort of explosion. He is incredibly powerful due to Idle Transfiguration, and it makes getting touched by him pretty much an insta-kill. And yes, I said touched, because the one condition for this ability is that he must make physical contact via his hands. And while for most lesser sorcerers this is the end, some advanced sorcerers can try to reinforce their bodies with cursed energy in order to block him, but that will mostly only work a single time. When used on himself, Idle Transfiguration can give Mahito many advantages, turning his body parts into weapons, healing him as aforementioned, and also generally make him very difficult to damage, because as long as he just maintains the shape of his soul, any damage pretty much just doesn't happen. And to try and damage him means to try and damage his soul, which only a handful of characters can actually do. But more importantly, because Mahito is intensely self-reflective, his own understanding of his soul and its shape continuously makes him stronger, which is why he, at the end, manages to essentially transform himself into his own perfect version, by changing his own soul into the perfect version of itself. This desire is also reflected in his domain expansion called Self-Embodiment of Perfection. This domain consists of multiple giant hands that engulf the target, and as long as you're inside of the domain, it's basically as if you're constantly being touched by Mahito, meaning there's nowhere for you to dodge when he tries to change the shape of your soul. This makes this domain extremely deadly to anyone who enters it. Additionally, Mahito is one of the few known curses who is able to produce a black flash, although he has only done so twice. Our next candidate is Jogo, another primordial cursed spirit, this time associated with fear of the earth and of fire. Being an ancient and very primordial spirit, Jogo is supremely powerful, having a lot of cursed energy and being capable to fuel it all into his innate cursed technique, Disaster Flames. This ability essentially allows him to create volcanoes and flame eruptions at any point he so chooses, allowing him to basically become a walking flamethrower whenever he wants. His mere presence can even ignite people whenever he so desires, as his body temperature is assumedly incredibly high. He also can create and control a species of insects called ember insects, which will sting the target and then explode. Jogo also holds the honor of being the only character in the story so far to have both a domain expansion and a maximum technique. Maximum Meteor is Jogo's maximum technique that creates a gigantic sphere of fire and hurls it at the target, which can cause immense destruction to the entire environment. This is incredibly deadly and is basically just a giant meteor impact. His domain expansion, Coffin of the Iron Mountain, creates a space filled with soot and lava, which, just through its temperature, can burn any target that gets captured into it, and he can also change the flow of the magma and of the stone itself to attack the target indefinitely. The last thing Jogo can do is that he can produce domain amplification, which is an ability that when it's first introduced in the story seems very weird and difficult to understand, but it's actually not that complicated. So, remember how simple domains are, for humans, learnable techniques that allow you to counter curse techniques and domain expansions, right? As a sorcerer, you kind of need that in your arsenal. Well, domain amplification is this equivalent, but seemingly for curses, as we've only seen cursed spirits use it. Domain amplification doesn't create a space within which you counter attacks, but instead creates an aura around you that immediately turns off any cursed techniques it comes into contact with. This makes it a supremely powerful counter against pretty much any opponent, but it comes at a cost. It neutralizes any cursed technique it comes in contact with, including the user, which means that you cannot use domain amplification and your cursed technique at the same time. You need to switch between them, which can spell your doom if you make the wrong choice which one to use in a given situation. Nonetheless, used widely, domain amplification can really save your life if you're fighting against someone whose technique is just absolutely unbeatable. Next up, we have Hanami, the primordial cursed spirit associated with fear of the forests and of plant life. As his role suggests, Hanami is mostly capable of manipulating plants through his innate cursed ability, Disaster Plants. Thanks to this ability, Hanami can essentially create illusionary plants that he can control to his desire however he pleases. This includes stabbing his opponents, creating giant walls of wood, or even creating flower fields that distract his enemies. What's important is that none of these plants are real. They are illusions that nonetheless seem to have a physical form, but they're fueled purely by Hanami's cursed energy. This has as a consequence that Hanami can actually just nullify them and make them disappear whenever he wants to, which can catch you off guard when you keep thinking that these are physical, actual objects. But no, Hanami can just create them with his immense cursed energy. This is important because plants technically don't have cursed energy, and so they cannot really be used for attacking. Hanami does have one of his arms modified so that he can absorb some of the life energy, some of the bioenergy within plants, and transform it into cursed energy for his liking, but he doesn't like to do it very often because he feels that this is disrespectful to plant life. Hanami also possesses a domain expansion, but we never got to see what it actually does. And he's also capable of using the aforementioned domain amplification, although Hanami ends up being a good example of what happens when you cannot choose wisely whether to use amplification or your curse technique. Next up, we have the final of the primordial cursed spirits, Dagon. Dagon is the cursed spirit associated with the fear of natural disasters including the seas and the oceans. His cute appearance within the anime is actually quite deceiving, because Dagon spends most of his life within the series as a cursed womb. To explain, when a very powerful cursed spirit is about to be born, he has to first hatch out of a sort of larval state. This is called a cursed womb. Usually, they are not capable of doing much by themselves, but in Dagon's case, his womb form was already so powerful that he could talk and communicate with his peers and even fight a little bit on his own. However, his true power wasn't revealed until he finally hatched from his cursed womb into the full cursed spirit of the oceans, at which point he also gained full control over his innate cursed technique, Disaster Tides. This ability allows him great control over all bodies of water and the ability to just create bodies of water whenever he wants to. He can spit out huge amount of watery torrents and then suck them back in, eating and killing anyone who got caught in the waves. Additionally, once he has matured, Dagon can produce a death swarm, a swarm of sea monster Shikigami which viciously eat their opponents alive until they're not alive anymore. This plays into his domain expansion, Horizon of the Captivating Skanda, which is a sunny beach island wherein his sea creatures are guaranteed to eat and kill you no matter how much you try and dodge, because this is, after all, a domain expansion where hits are guaranteed. Moving on from the disaster curses, we have one of the strongest cursed spirits in the entire series, Ryomen Sukuna. Sukuna is to cursed spirits what Gojo is to humans, an insurmountable wall of power. The difference is that while we know a lot about Gojo's abilities, we know very little about Sukuna's. We know he has an immense amount of cursed energy, and is able to freely switch between using cursed energy and reverse cursed energy. And we know he seems to have some sort of cursed technique, but we don't know any specifics because his abilities are very difficult to pin down. For one, he seems to have a lot of cutting-based abilities. One of his abilities is called Dismantle, and it cuts inanimate objects whenever Sukuna wants to, whereas Cleave adjusts itself to cut specifically things with a certain level of cursed energy. These two cutting abilities would assumedly be his main cursed technique, but no, seemingly not, because Sukuna can also say whatever the fuck this means and open some sort of inventory of other abilities, where, for example, he can just pull out the ability to manipulate fire better than Jogo, the literal spirit of fire. Luckily, one thing we do know about is his domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine, which produces a sort of Buddhist shrine decorated with skulls. Malevolent Shrine is unique in the series because, despite being a domain expansion, it does not create a barrier or a pocket space. Instead, the shrine is summoned into the real world. This constitutes a sort of binding vow for Sukuna within himself. Because he doesn't produce a pocket space, he gives all of his opponents the opportunity to escape, something you usually cannot just do with domain expansions. This ability to escape puts Sukuna at a disadvantage, but because it is Jujutsu, he also gains an advantage from it. In exchange for not having a barrier, the radius of Malevolent Shrine's effect is huge, almost 200 meters at its maximum potency. And within that radius of 200 meters, while there is no barrier, anything within those 200 meters will get automatically cleaved into bits by Sukuna's two cutting abilities, making it incredibly deadly and basically making the whole escaping angle pretty much void. It was so utterly destructive that it left a distinctive hole in the Shibuya district of Japan. Moving on, we get to the Cursed Womb death paintings, the three brothers Choso, Eiso, and Kechizu. A little history on these. Long ago, there was a woman who was capable to produce half-human, half-cursed babies. She was taken in by an evil sorcerer called Noritoshi Kamo, no, not that one, this one, and experimented on, producing 9 aborted fetuses that were half-human, half-curse. These three brothers are the strongest 3 of those 9 fetuses, incarnated into physical bodies during the events of the series. Because they were created by a man of the Kamo clan, they inherit some of the abilities of the Kamo curse techniques, namely all the blood-related ones. But because they are gross mutant children, their ability to control blood has a couple of additional gross kinks. For starters, all of their blood is poisonous and toxic. This is called the rot technique. If you ingest their blood through any means, you will suffer greatly. And if you ingest either the blood of Eiso or Kechizu, the 2 younger brothers, either of them can activate the decay technique. This cursed technique will essentially just eat whoever was infected with the blood from the inside out, killing an adult human being within about 15 minutes. Eiso, the Jojo-looking brother, additionally has a maximum technique called Maximum Winking, also called Supreme Art Winking before it was officially changed to Maximum. This ability pushes his blood controlling ability to its limit and allows him to essentially create wings out of his blood and control them like tentacles that attack his opponent, which is made deadly by the fact that his blood is corrosive and toxic. However, Eso cannot use maximum winking and decay at the same time. He has to switch between the two. And again, if you make a mistake and use the wrong one at the wrong time, it can cost you dearly. Now, Choso is the oldest brother, and therefore has the most sophisticated power set, basically having inherited the full blood manipulation crowned technique of the Kamo clan, and being able to use it better than most of the people within the clan itself. He can use all of their nicks and doodads. He can shoot it as missiles, he can compress them into little bombs, he can make them explode into supernovas, he can make knives out of them, he can steroid himself, even more so than the other Noritoshi Kamo, and is overall in complete control over all properties of his blood at any given point, making him incredibly deadly to fight. Lastly, maybe the most recognizable cursed spirit in the entire series, the Finger Bearer. This is not one cursed spirit, but a type of special grade cursed spirit that is born when cursed wombs are spawned from Sukuna's fingers. Remember, cursed wombs are essential larvae of very strong cursed spirits, and when one of them is born by being combined into one of Sukuna's fingers, one of the remains of Ryomen Sukuna, they produce a Finger Bearer, which are incredibly powerful and able to just spit cursed energy however they want. However, all of their abilities fall into the category of non-techniques. They can hit you with cursed energy, they can shoot cursed energy at you, but they don't have a cursed technique. They are not refined enough for that. But they are still so powerful that whenever one of them is born, they distort space around them into a sort of pseudo-domain expansion, where there is no technique that will instantly kill you, and yet you're still trapped in a weird, non-logical space. Finally, we are in the last stretch of the video, where we talk about human enemies, curse users. Remember, these are just evil Jujutsu sorcerers. There is functionally no difference between them and sorcerers. They are just evil and against the Jujutsu government. First up, we start with Suguru Geto, one of the main antagonists and Gojo's old lover, slash best friend, slash whatever you want to call this. Geto is, alongside Gojo, Yuta, and Yuki, considered one of the 4 special grade sorcerers, and it's easy to see why he's held in such high regard. His innate cursed technique is called spirit manipulation, and it allows him to control cursed spirits. In order to do so, he has to dominate them first and then absorb them into little black orbs and ingest them orally. Once he has done that, he can essentially use them as a free summon whenever he wants to, and as long as they don't get permanently destroyed, he has access to them. This allows him a huge arsenal of wide-ranging abilities, since there seems to be no limit to how many curses he can control under his wing. It's important to note, though, that the process of ingesting a cursed spirit is apparently really gross. Geto is also the 3rd and, so far, last character to have a maximum technique. Maximum Uzumaki is an ability wherein Geto takes most of the cursed spirits he has, a massive number of them, and combines them into one giant nuclear attack, basically. This ability creates a giant crater and will annihilate anyone that stands against it. And at first, it seems a bit weird to collect all these curses only to then throw them at someone and waste them, because this does permanently destroy all the curses involved in the attack. However, if you have a cursed spirit within your collection that has an innate curse technique above a certain level, and you kill that curse using the Uzumaki, that curse technique will be extracted and inherited by Geto, meaning he can collect curse techniques if he plays his card right. This is how he acquired Mahito's Idol Transfiguration, although the guy who got it is not Geto, it's Kenjaku in Geto's body, but that's a separate video for a separate day. Basically, Uzumaki allows you to nuke your enemies and steal the techniques of the guys that you enslaved. Good ability. Moving into pretty much the last major character of this video, we have Toji Fushiguro, Megumi's dad. This absolute unit of a man doesn't have a cursed technique. In fact, he has no cursed energy at all. Similarly to Maki, he is afflicted with a heavenly restriction. No cursed energy, superhuman body. However, his case is special. While it is known that heavenly restrictions heavily reduce your cursed energy and give you superhuman strength, Toji is the only example in the series where he was born with absolutely zero, nada, zilch cursed energy, completely being invisible to the cursed world. But in exchange, he was given a body, a physical existence so strong that he can not only keep up with sorcerers, but even gained a reputation as the sorcerer killer. He is so fucking overpowered on the physical realm that his 5 senses, seeing, touching, feeling, hearing, all of that, they got so strong and so boosted that they looped back around to being able to see curses and curse techniques, something he should not be able to do. But this alone doesn't make him so dangerous. It is also that he is immensely crafty and resourceful. Toji has created a master-servant relationship with a cursed spirit that can have infinite amounts of weapons stored within its stomach. Toji himself then stores that spirit within his stomach so that the cursed spirit is itself also invisible as it gets shielded by Toji's invisible tummy. This means he can smuggle cursed weapons like swords and shuriken into wherever he wants without ever being detected, making him the perfect assassin. And even trying to summon him after death went wrong because his soul and his body were so powerful that it just overpowered the summoner and took control of their own fate again, because of fucking course. Speaking of summoners, here in the final stretch we get to Granny Ogami, a curse user that spent most of her life being a hitman. Her ability is the Seance technique, which allows her to summon the body or soul information of a deceased person using their corpse or anything that they have from them. Then they can shapeshift either herself or a willing participant into that said person. Ogami is specifically very careful to only ever summon the body information of a person and never their soul, so that they can't take control of the participant who's being shapeshifted or of herself. Of course, this backfired when she summoned Toji Fushiguro, whose body is so overpowered that she could not hold him. Next up, we have the other curse user hitman, Jiro Awasaka, and his innate curse technique, Inverse. Inverse is exactly what it sounds like. It makes weak attacks strong and strong attack weaks, specifically the attacks that the user receives. Basically, when Inverse is activated, a really strong punch will do almost no damage to Awasaka, while a very weak and small punch will almost kill him. By using this ability tactfully, Awasaka can essentially just avoid ever being damaged. However, if you can start attacking with multiple degrees of power at the same time, strong haymakers mixed in with weak little taps, Awasaka cannot really compensate and activate and deactivate the technique at the right time, and therefore can become overwhelmed. Additionally, Inverse has a maximum and minimum limit of power, because if it were simply endless on both fronts, air resistance would just kill the guy the moment he activates his ability. Next we have the curse user little shithead Haruta Shigemo. This man's curse technique is really funny. Basically, his curse technique is called miracles. As you go throughout your life, you may find little small miracles in your luck. Things that don't change your life but are still cool and interesting. Like when you wake up and get to see the number on the clock have the same digit over and over. Like if you wake up at 22 past 2 and go, oh, that's cool. Those are considered miracles, according to Shigemo's curse technique. And whenever he experiences something like that, it is stored and his memories of it erased. After that, a black mark appears under his eye. These black marks are essentially stored miracles or luck boosters, and whenever his life is in danger, one of these marks is used up in order for him to survive something he really shouldn't. However, because of the way this technique works with erasing his memories of the miracles he sees, Shigemo is not actually aware of his technique or of how many miracles he has left, which is what ended up killing him because he didn't realize that he was just out of luck. And finally, the last character for this way too long video is Junpei Yoshino, the tragic curse user that we couldn't save. He doesn't have an innate curse technique because he wasn't really born a sorcerer. He can see curses and has moderate amounts of cursed energy, but he isn't skillful enough to create or maintain his own curse technique. But he has been able to learn how to summon a Shikigami called Moondregs, which is a large jellyfish which can paralyze and poison its victims with a unique poison that covers the skin in black spots that burn the victim as if they were being stung. It is fairly brutal and is just symbolic of the poison and vitriol that Junpei felt. And that was it. That was every ability in Jujutsu Kaisen that I consider worth explaining. There are a couple I skipped over because we know basically nothing about them, or it mattered so little that no one in their right mind is going to be curious about it. But if you are still curious about more, you can always visit the wiki for yourself or just reread the series, which I actually recommend over reading the wiki. Thank you for watching, and oh my god, my throat is basically dead. I sure hope you all enjoyed it, because I'm never doing this shit again. This accidentally became the biggest project on my channel ever, so yeah. Also, a big thank you to all of our patrons, as always, including Daniel Garcia, Fiction Ape, Cini, Geo, Ignis, Jameson Tate, Mr. Meander, Mr. Walrus, Paracha, Peroskoko, Project Iceman, and Razor Roy. Thank you again, and I will go take a long nap. Goodbye.